So Keith, everybody's doing 30-second videos of what they remember about the society. We've been asked to do something as well. So they're trying to get us to compress 30 years into 30 seconds, which is really going to be a miracle if we can do it. But what are your first memories of the society?
You were running a course on behalf of the Football Association at Lilleshall, and I was a participant on that course. And I had just done a physiotherapy course, and it was nothing to do with sport. What you were delivering was exactly what I thought physiotherapy would give me. And so that's my first memory, is what the stuff you were giving us was just fantastic, exactly what I needed at that particular time.
That was actually before, wasn't it? That was about 2 or 3 years before we actually started.
Yeah. So you and I had a discussion, and it was decided that we were going to run this new profession, and then very rapidly you'd amassed all the right people, you got all the right paperwork together, and we had a couple of meetings prior to it all being set up, and then there were the key 4 of us who then signed the documentation as the first 4.
Yeah, it's interesting because when you actually think about it, you know, there are certain things you remember, and you know, people often say to me, sort of, why do it? And I think it was, you were part of a group that I was beginning to meet within football, and I suddenly realised that there was this group of people who had phenomenal skills treating injuries, and yet they weren't being recognised but for what they did. And the more I learned about them, the more I realised that, you know, yeah, it was exactly what was needed at that time in football and also in sport.
You might remember this thing that I'm holding in my hand. Tell us a little bit about the production of that magazine.
There you go. It's funny you should mention that. This was Sports Therapy. And if you remember, this was a journal we put together in 1990. So April, May 1990, the society had only been going a few months. And we put together, well, overall 5 journals. And I think when it was set up, people didn't take it seriously. But when this was produced, and it went to every governing body in sport, it went to every cricket club, it went to every rugby club, football club, we really sent it out, and I think people suddenly sat back and went, oh my God, maybe there is something here. So this was really a catalyst to people believing that what we were doing was actually happening.
So we're recording this 2020. We started in 1990. Can you remember the first AGM?
I can remember it very clearly. It was at Aston Villa, and Jim Walker was there at the time. He was one of the original members. We needed an AGM. Jim said, let's do it at Villa. So we need a speaker. And they just appointed Dr. Joseph Venglos, who was a doctor of physiology. He was a really phenomenal man with regards to science, and in a way revolutionised a lot of things that were done within football. When he went to Villa, a lot of people thought, who is this man? What on earth is he on about? His training ideas. And he just said, you know, would you like me to speak? To have somebody of that calibre for the very first one. So yeah, Keith, I do, I remember it very, very clearly. If we move on sort of through this timeline, basically one of the key things was education. And I think in those original discussions, we all agreed that it was an important part and it had to progress.
Absolutely.
What do you recall about some of those developments? You know, what's probably one of the most significant things that stands out in your mind about that education pathway?
I think the most significant thing was the start of our very first degree programme. It was held at North London University, and I think it was 96, and it was validated. You and I were at the validation panel. It went through very, very rapidly, and everybody said it was terrific, and we went across the road and we celebrated at El Rincon's Greasy Spoon Cafe.
Yeah, probably it's amazing, you know, of all the achievements, that one of the things we still do remember is you had a cup of tea, I had hot chocolate, you had a Danish, I had a donut, but it was a pretty prominent day as well.
It was. We had discussions about getting statutory regulation for sports therapy, and I think it was 1998 with the old Council for Professions Supplementary to Medicine, the predecessors to the HCPC. We went along and we had discussions. Can you remember much about that day and the discussions that we had?
Yeah, I think it's interesting when you, again, I suppose when you reflect back, that was before statutory regulation really came in and the HCPC was formed. But at that time, the organisation that oversaw allied health was the Council for Professions Supplementary to Medicine. And I was on CSP Council at the time, and I remember having discussions, and what you realise then is that there was a need to have some kind of recognition, and at that point in time, the only way to really be recognised was to be part of that group, and we needed to talk and see how it was going to be done. The discussions were quite productive, but of course within a couple of years they were disbanded in HCPC, and then we had to start on a completely different journey. But I think it helped us to focus on what was required to take us forward. Just thinking of that journey, I'm not sure how much you remember, but there was a significant amount of work that we had to do once we started on the application. And I know that we had to produce a lot of paperwork and get a lot of support. We had a lot of letters of support from governing bodies in sport, from sports stars, from MPs, from politicians, and all of those went into the documentation. I didn't actually make the journey to London. You went down with Ros Nottingham and John McCready. What can you remember from that day? You know?
I can remember beforehand the discussion about how we're going to get them there, because I decided I was going to go by train, but these volumes were so huge I would not have made it by train. So I had to drive up to London to be able to deliver the volumes, and they were huge pieces of work. So, you know.
I don't know if you remember, but and I suppose you remember the size, but we actually had three what I suppose were massive tomes. I suppose that's the best word for them. But we also had to produce 70 other abridged copies.
Correct.
I mean, the amount of it would have needed a truck to take the stuff down there.
Yeah.
I think it's amazing how those things slip from the memory until we sit down and have to do something like this, and then there's a lot of work that went into that. Phenomenal amount of work, wasn't there?
Yeah, and I've still got the books at home, so they're huge.
Good nighttime reading.
So having delivered all that paperwork and made some amendments as well that were asked for, we were then ready, and we were asked to go and present to the council for the Health Professions Council, the full council. What do you remember of that day?
That's another probably one of those vivid memories, because I know that there was yourself, there was Ros Nottingham, Maggie McNerney, John McCready. Went to Park Lane where HCPC was. There was a full council meeting. They were all sitting around the table, and I then had to give the presentation basically to justify why we felt that they should make the recommendation. I'm not sure how much you remember on it, but you know, it was it was traumatic in the importance of it. It wasn't traumatic to give it, but the importance. And I can still remember I think I finished the presentation off and said that, you know, they were obviously the council that looked after the allied health professions, and we were outside that box, but they had a responsibility, and what it was going to require was for them to think outside the normal to protect the public. And I know that from that meeting there were lots of questions, and you can remember the questions being fired up, but what happened from the documentation, and obviously, and people sometimes forget, the recommendation was made that, you know, that sports therapy and sports therapy should be statutorily regulated. Probably again another of those days that's quite vivid in the memory, but you know, on the journey through the 30 years, you know, a major milestone, I think.
I think you're right, and if you remember, I think there were 49 council members, and it was unanimous that we should be statutorily regulated, so that's a pretty good achievement, so well done.
But the one thing you didn't remember is, where did we go afterwards? Greasy spoon around the corner.
We did.
We did.
So the presentation that we did to the Health Professions Council wasn't the only presentation that we had to give, and you and I went to some places, sometimes you went on your own. Tell us a little bit about the journey that you undertook.
Yeah, it's again, it's amazing what comes up when we start digging back into the memory. We actually went to the Welsh Assembly, And again, it was yourself, John McCready, and Baggy McNerney, and we had to present to the basically to the Welsh ministers down there. And if you remember that was probably more traumatic than the HCPC.
I remember it well.
Scottish Parliament, you and I, we went and had a meeting at the Scottish Parliament, and probably the one I did go on my own, which I always remember again as one of those days you look at and go, wow, am I really in this building? Was I went to Stormont, and I had discussions at Stormont, and the reason was because whilst we were looking for UK regulation, each of the devolved countries did and still do have the right to regulate on their own. So it was important to also do the presentations to them. So yeah, it's I do remember, a stormy night in Cardiff. Yeah,
very good.
One of the things I always do remember about yourself, Keith, is that often in the early days we used to have discussions about visions, and you always had this vision about we needed smaller groups to be doing some of the work, because we couldn't all have it on a board of directors or a council as it was at that time, and you had the idea about the 2 small groups, which have proved to be really quite successful. What's your thoughts on those?
The idea for the groups was not just to undertake some of the work that the board of directors deemed necessary, but it was also to inculcate those youngsters into the running of the society, so that there was going to be a long game in that we brought people through who could eventually come onto the council or onto the board of directors and take over our jobs, basically.
Yeah. I mean, when you look at it, the communications groups, has really had an effective role in helping to take us with bringing, I was going to say, communication into the 21st century, but for you and I, into the 19th century. And obviously with the UCLG, I think, this group of graduates that are in the profession going around and talking to the universities has been quite powerful. And, I suppose as we go forward, we now need to start thinking of more groups that should be, introduced. So, good idea, sir. Well done.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's all right.
I remember in the setting up of the society, you did a lot of research, and one of the bits of research you did, you looked at other organisations around the world similar to what we were trying to do, and you spoke to people in America. Tell us about that.
Well, obviously in the States there, the NATA, Canada, CATA, and very much the philosophies were the same, but other than looking at it, we didn't do too much to do with it until 1996. I suddenly get out of the blue this email from this strange man in America by the name of George Waldon, who's at Virginia Commonwealth University, who contacted to say, looking at what we've done, and basically very similar type of problems, I'm going to be in Glasgow next week, can we meet up? So this man meets up, and it was Colin Jackson and John McCready and myself, we met up. From that moment on, you suddenly realised, and you, like me, have become very close friends with him, that we had this bonding for the same thought processes, the same problems, the same initiatives, and from that, we then developed sort of why can't we get somebody to go to the States, and then we had the first one of the sort of student scholarship went to Virginia Commonwealth University, and from that it's developed with Virginia Commonwealth University, Windsor in Canada, and York University, and really it was from George, contacting and making that, and as I say, probably we've become quite close friends with him, you and I, over the years, and if he hadn't emailed, we probably wouldn't have built up so many of the relationships that we've now got the other side of the pond, and and for the society and for students, and also for members who have the travelling scholarships. I think that's just been, from that one email, and so much has grown out of it. Moving forward and sort of coming up more to recent times, remember last year we decided to set up and be linked to a charity. We went for Transplant Sport, and I know that for a lot of members it was, why did we pick that and why did we not pick others? And last November we held the very first inaugural conference for Transplant Sports at Coventry University. I'd been very much involved in all of that, but you came really not knowing much about it. What were your impressions of that day? Because it wasn't just members speaking, there were transplantees there as well.
Yeah, I was really pleased to see the numbers of people, first of all, and the speakers and what they had to offer in terms of transplant and the problems that transplant people have, and the fact that they wanted these games and they want people to be active even though they've had all these kind of different issues and transplants, and the quality of the speakers as well from all over the world. So I was really, really pleased to see what kind of a conference it turned into. I didn't expect it to be so powerful.
And I think there were some powerful messages, and I suppose where we sit at this moment in time, and with what's going on with COVID-19 and the problems, I think it makes it even stronger that the society has to have that link and you know, with the ambition that we can do more for those transplant athletes for whenever they do return. So, you know, I'm glad you enjoyed it, and I think it just showed really the diversity of the organisation, didn't it?
Absolutely, and you know, I work with disabled athletes, so transplant athletes is yet another problem area that we need to get into and to try to help if we can. Graham, here we sit in 2020, 30 years on, but I don't think anybody quite expected what has happened in this momentous year for us, but it's also a momentous year for all sorts of other reasons. Tell us what your thoughts are.
When we started 2020, we looked forward to 30 years. I think, you know, we did have a completely different vision of what's going to happen. And then with what's happened since March with the pandemic, I think sitting back and being in the office in Glasgow, we get a lot of information that comes through. And I think that for the society, our members have done some phenomenal things during the pandemic. The number have been contacted, and the universities at this, you know, at this time now we accredit, you know, 30 universities, 38 academic programs, and we're having to help to produce the sports and exercise therapists of the future, and it's a future that's going to be completely different to where we were and the profession that we went into. So, and having those universities working alongside us and working with us, and the roadmap that we've put down for how we see it for the future has been well accepted. So I think as you look from 30 years onwards, it's whilst you look around and it's a hard time, I think there has to be positive optimism about what we as a profession can offer.
Do you think that the universities can help us through this mire as well, because they have expertise and knowledge that might assist us? How do you see that?
I think it's a two-way process, Keith. I think that we need them helping us, but obviously they also have their own major issues to contend with, because how do you deal with the number of students? But we've got to produce professionals that are safe and competent, not for the end of this year, not when they graduate, but in the years to come. And sometimes getting that message across has been, it's not been hard, it's been a challenge, because what we must ensure, going all the way back why statutory regulation was important, is that we as a profession have a responsibility to our members and to protect the public. And as you know, when we go all the way back to 1988, 1989 when we were talking about it, that was the main issue, but at that time it was about protecting footballers. Now it's about protecting the public. So the philosophy hasn't changed in 30 years. If we go all the way back, and we go back to you were on the course at Eddershaw, and the guys, you know, what happens to us? Where do we go now? And you think of the discussions we had, and you know, we must never forget Geoffrey Summers. You know, Geoffrey, who was at that time the head of the Injured Jockeys Fund, he'd set that up. He helped us so much. And we're sitting here, we're smiling, and we've got good memories. You know, we have taken quite a lot of flack on the way. So it's not all been roses. So if I said to you now, if we went all the way back, would you do it again?
My answer is unequivocally yes, because I think it's absolutely needed, more so than ever perhaps now, because there aren't people out there as qualified as our sports therapists in dealing with sports injuries, not just for those elite people, but for the recreational athletes, the joggers, transplantees, disability sport. You need to have very, very special or specialised training to be able to deal with those kind of people, and I think we produce that kind of person.
It's interesting you didn't mention post-COVID patients as well, because I think that's another area that you suddenly look at now, that there are people that are going to require a lot of work with regards to rehabilitation that have come through this pandemic. So I'm glad you do it again, because I would do it again. Yeah.
I'm glad you said that, because I was going to ask you the same question.
Yeah, and as you know, I took quite a lot of. Will I do it again? Yes, because I believed in it 30 years ago, and I believe in it now. The only thing that I would say is, we're 30 years old. We're a mature profession, and sometimes what frustrates me is that we still get treated like a naughty young teenager that's just started. You know, when you look at, we have the AGM tonight, and you look at some of the guys that are here, you know, they're mature professionals. So I think, yes, I would, but as we look forward, you know, yeah, we've been here for a while, and we're going to be here for much longer.
Here's to the next 30 years.
Here's to the next 30, yeah.